You've heard it 1,000 times. Just break inheritance and your SharePoint permissions headache is solved. But what if I told you that's the start of a bigger nightmare? Today, we're busting the top myths about fine-grained permissions and revealing the real risks hiding behind that so-called quick fix. Sound familiar? Let's unpack what actually happens behind the scenes before you break something you can't put back together. The inheritance illusion. Why breaking the chain feels good, but isn't. If you've ever handed out unique permissions in SharePoint to solve one request, thinking it's just a quick patch, you're in familiar company. The break inheritance button is almost like a panic button for busy admins. It's there, it's easy to use, and it feels like it fixes the problem on the spot. Someone needs access to a folder, but not the rest of the site. Click break inheritance, grant the permission, and you're done. On paper, it's a solved ticket, a happy user, and you move on. But what if that instant sense of control is setting you up for an even bigger mess? There's a reason breaking inheritance is the go-to for a lot of SharePoint admins. The UI makes it simple, it looks surgical, a precision job for the one unique need that crops up. But the convenience is deceptive. There's an underlying myth that by breaking permissions at the item or folder level, you'll keep things more organized, more precise, and therefore more secure. In reality, what you're doing is splitting the wiring behind the walls and hoping it all works out in the end. Let's put this in real-world terms. Picture a public library where instead of a single system to unlock the stacks, every book gets its own lock, each one with a slightly different key. When there are only a few special books, maybe the librarian can keep track. But give it some time and there are keys all over the place, requests for replacements, lost keys, and a librarian who's trying to keep a spreadsheet just to remember who can open what. What started as an attempt at tighter security turns into chaos. Anyone who's been on the admin side of a SharePoint site knows this feeling. You start off with a plan, but then one exception leads to another. And pretty soon every folder has its own independent set of rules. This isn't just a hypothetical mess either. Research into SharePoint adoption in enterprise environments shows a clear pattern. As the number of unique permissions grows, mistakes increase, people get added to libraries they shouldn't see, while urgent requests get stuck in ticket limbo because nobody knows why a document isn't visible. Microsoft's own best practices repeatedly warn that breaking inheritance should be a last resort, precisely because it multiplies the chance of permission errors and accidental data exposure. The audit trail becomes a maze. Every unique permission is another path you have to track and eventually explain. Here's where it really starts to spiral. Each unique permission means extra complexity for SharePoint's security model. Instead of pulling from a streamlined inherited structure, now the platform has to check for special exceptions every time someone clicks a file, runs a search, or requests access. The more you do it, the heavier the burden on both admins and the platform itself. Finding who has access to this document turns into a detective case because the answer might be hidden under layers of broken inheritance and leftover test accounts. There's also a reporting nightmare brewing. Permissions reports lose clarity, especially as unique items pile up. A quick export of site permissions might only tell half the story since broken inheritance separates those sub-items from overall visibility. This fragmentation doesn't just complicate audits, it erodes your ability to manage risk. Internal reviews bog down in details, department heads start flagging files they can't access, and IT spends more time investigating mismatched access than delivering real value. If you think these unique breaks are rare, think again. Most admins underestimate just how fast this scatter effect grows. It starts with a single urgent request, then a manager wants to share a subfolder with a vendor, someone else needs access for a week, and suddenly the number of unique permissions triples before you've even had your second coffee. The growth is exponential, not linear. And unless someone audits regularly, the sprawl goes unchecked. It's only when a compliance review rolls around, or worse, when something slips through the cracks, that the true scale becomes visible. Microsoft's advice isn't just written for compliance teams. They've built their own systems around the core principle of inheritance because it scales, it's transparent, and it's built for auditability. Relying on groups and inherited permissions isn't just a best practice, it's how you prevent permission spread from turning into a security and maintenance nightmare. Every time you press that Stop Inheriting Permissions button, you're chipping away at the clarity and manageability of your site. So while it feels satisfying to resolve a unique access ticket by cracking open permissions for one person, each exception is a small step toward complexity you can't see until it starts costing real time and creating real risk. Maintenance gets trickier, support costs mount, and fixing things after the fact becomes a major project rather than a small adjustment. That's the illusion. The supposed quick fix is actually a risk multiplier and a ticking headache. And if you've wondered what's actually going on beneath the surface every time you break the chain, you're about to find out the costs most people miss, especially when SharePoint starts acting up in ways that are anything but random. Behind the curtain, performance, security, and the hidden costs. You don't have to look far to find someone dealing with a slow SharePoint site or dealing with permissions gone sideways. On the surface, these problems might seem random, just another glitch in a big platform. But underneath every broken inheritance chain is adding strain. SharePoint doesn't just store files, it checks permissions on nearly every action. Each unique permission means a special rule that needs to be tracked and enforced. And the more unique permissions you throw into the mix, the bigger the drag on the entire system. From the admin view, it's easy to create a few one-off exceptions and move on. 5 folders with unique permissions doesn't feel like much. Maybe you grant a VP access to a sensitive folder, or a vendor gets a peek at just one document library. All good, right? But then one project turns into 2, the sales team requests isolated spaces for each client, and before long, those one-off decisions multiply. There's a moment when things just break bad, a tipping point where the platform goes from brisk to sluggish, and the headaches start rolling in. Performance hits aren't just guessing games. Microsoft lays out hard numbers for how SharePoint handles unique permissions. According to their documentation, when a list or library crosses about 5,000 unique permission items, you're officially out on thin ice. That doesn't sound like much, but consider how fast you can reach that if you're responding to exceptions left and right. A single team site with folders for each project, subfolders for each client, and special permissions along the way can rack up hundreds of unique items in no time. Most admins don't notice the threshold until files start taking ages to load, permission checks grind, or users start opening more tickets about missing content. Let's drop into a real-world scenario. Picture a finance team's SharePoint site. For years, they managed access using inheritances and groups, until a big audit forced them to clamp down on who could see what. The fix was to break inheritance on every quarterly report folder, then on every archived set, and before long, every document batch had its own exceptions. For a while, nobody noticed anything wrong. Then one quarter, reports started timing out. The search indexer lagged behind, showing old versions or missing files entirely. What changed? Nothing dramatic, just a creeping buildup of unique permissions until the system could barely keep up with itself. The site hadn't grown in size, but suddenly every file access required SharePoint to zigzag through a maze of exceptions before displaying a result. Security complications crop up at exactly the same time. It's one thing to have a handful of unique permissions, easy to spot, simple to check, but multiply that out across dozens or hundreds of sites, and mistakes are almost guaranteed. The more exceptions, the higher the chance someone gets access to something they shouldn't. Maybe it's a former team member who should have lost permissions months ago, or a partner who only needed access for a week but still has it. Sometimes the only way anyone discovers the issue is after a sensitive document lands in the wrong inbox, or an auditor flags files surfaced in a search that should have been locked down. These aren't edge cases. In organizations with sprawling SharePoint use, these incidents show up with uncomfortable regularity. Auditing turns into pure detective work. On a clean site, pulling a permissions report is routine. With broken inheritance scattered everywhere, it's more like piecing together a crime scene. Some users have access from direct assignments, others get in through nested groups. Some folders follow inheritance, others don't. Even PowerShell scripts, which should offer clarity, start timing out or throwing errors when the permission landscape gets too irregular. There are admins who spend days or weeks mapping out who has access to what, without full confidence they've found every path. All this constant firefighting forces IT teams into a reactive corner. Instead of planning for scalable growth or focusing on security improvements, time gets chewed up with access reviews, chasing ticket trails, and writing explanations for each unique exception. Users lose trust along the way as requests take longer and longer to resolve. The site doesn't just feel slower, it is slower and far harder to manage at scale. Every time you break inheritance, you save a few minutes in the moment, but someone, often you, will pay it back with hours of investigation later. It's not dramatic right out of the gate. The issues creep in slowly, a search here, a permissions check there, all stacking up until normal operations feel sluggish and convoluted. So if unique permissions aren't giving you control, but actually sowing confusion and instability, where should you focus? The real difference comes down to how you use groups, both inside SharePoint and through Active Directory. Most admins think these are interchangeable, but that misconception has its own set of traps. The next step is figuring out how these group models stack up. and where most strategies go off track. Let's break down what happens when you put groups to work the right way and when you don't. Groups versus granularity, the permission model, most people get wrong. Let's get real about groups because this is the junction where most SharePoint security models go off the rails. A lot of people see SharePoint groups and Active Directory groups as two sides of the same coin, but the way they behave behind the scenes is totally different. And skipping groups altogether, just piling permissions onto specific people or folders, usually lands you right back in unique permission disaster territory. Picture yourself as a building manager. You could hand out a separate key to every staff member for every office. It'll work technically, but at scale, you drown in key rings and confusion. That's where SharePoint groups come in. They're your master keys. Compare that with unique permissions, which are like those single-use keys you instantly regret making after your 12th trip to the hardware store. SharePoint groups were designed for site-level control. When you assign a group to a site or library, you keep things tidy, easy to audit, easy to manage as team members shift. But here's where the confusion starts. Some IT teams default to AD groups, thinking they'll simply reflect what's happening across the whole organization. The problem is those AD groups are usually maintained by a completely different team. They're meant for roles that span departments, think all marketing or compliance reviewers. If you use AD groups for project work or temporary access, your SharePoint site ends up stuck with out-of-date memberships and permissions that lag behind changes on the org chart. On the other hand, some SharePoint admins shy away from groups, calling them too broad, and go back to the just this folder, just this person routine. The result, you're once again dealing with unique permissions, only now you've created a double headache. The security model fragments, you have to update permissions one by one as people come and go, and reporting becomes a spreadsheet nightmare. Meanwhile, the original promise of groups, easy onboarding and offboarding, gets lost. If you look inside your SharePoint permissions, you'll probably see both group types at work. SharePoint groups listed right next to AD groups, but SharePoint doesn't handle them the same way. SharePoint groups live locally at the site collection level and update instantly. AD groups depend on syncing that might not always be up to date. This sync isn't just about speed, it's about accuracy. If a user leaves a team, an IT admin has to remember to remove them from the AD group and then wait for the next directory sync before the change filters down into SharePoint. If you're using both but skipping formal reviews and updates, you end up with ghost access. You think someone's locked out, but they're wandering through your files anyway. The technical differences get even deeper. SharePoint caches permissions for groups differently based on type. Changes to SharePoint group membership take effect immediately, which is great for swift access changes in fast-moving projects. AD group membership changes, especially for cloud-only users, might see delays as directory synchronization works through its cycle. In smaller teams, that lag is just an annoyance. At scale, it creates audit blind spots. At audit time, you'll have to check two systems for every user. Did you get them out of the AD group or just out of the SharePoint group? Is the sync caught up? Now imagine you try to automate reporting and you start getting inconsistent results where some scripts see the live SharePoint group, others pick up old AD memberships. Plenty of admins run into trouble mixing SharePoint and AD groups for the same site. Maybe you set up site owners as an AD group, members as a SharePoint group, and start granting direct access for external vendors. It sounds harmless, but then when the membership of one group changes, nobody's quite sure who actually has access. A user who leaves the company might get removed from the SharePoint group, but not the AD group or vice versa. The responsibility to update access gets divided across IT, project leads, and maybe even HR, so it's easy for holes to open up. That's why best practice isn't a secret handshake. It's the discipline of deciding which group goes where. Use SharePoint groups for anything that's project-based, temporary, or local to a specific site. That means every time you launch a new project space or collaboration hub, you create a group within SharePoint to handle members, visitors, or owners. For access that stretches across multiple sites or the entire organization, like company-wide, the HR or all staff groups, use AD groups. Always avoid handing out permissions directly to individuals unless you fully expect to track and remove each of those assignments one by one. Temporary access, that should go through groups too. Set up a process where access requests are reviewed and expire on a schedule, not a break inheritance quick fix that you forget about after the project ends. And when you get this right, something practical happens. Audits become routine. Onboarding and offboarding take minutes instead of days. Nobody's digging around for a lost set of keys when someone leaves the company. Now, if your environment is already buried under years of unique permissions and scattered group assignments, don't panic. The next step is figuring out how to unravel the mess and rebuild a model that actually works instead of hoping no one asks too many questions at your next audit. So, rebuilding trust, recovering from permission chaos. If your SharePoint permissions look like a box of tangled charging cables with mystery adapters no one remembers owning, you're not some rare outlier. Plenty of admins open up the permissions panel and have that moment of, where do I even start? Most of us have inherited at least one site where the old admin used direct user permissions like a fix-all, broke inheritance on entire folder trees, and left documentation sitting in an offline OneNote file from 3 years ago. The urge to flatten everything and start over is real. But let's talk about what actually works when you walk into a scenario like this, where the line between what's accessible and what's lost is starting to blur. It's easy to underestimate how deep these problems go until you're asked a simple question: can you show me who has access to all the files in legal? Suddenly, the weight of every past exception crashes down. The site has grown by adding users directly, granting quick access for seasonal staff, and inevitably the old let's just break inheritance here for that one request move. Some permissions were granted 2 mergers ago, some as a one-off for an urgent board meeting, and now nobody knows what's left over. Teams panic when sensitive audit documents are harder to locate than they should be. And when users do notice their access has shifted or vanished, trust in IT starts to erode. If they see names on the permissions list they don't recognize and can open private files, they're rightfully skeptical about how protected their data really is. You're not facing this alone either. Many environments live with broken inheritance on everything from document libraries down to single PowerPoint files, and there's almost never a straightforward map. The problem compounds with every handoff. Each admin brings their own habits, and by the time that third or fourth round of temporary breaks has landed, the current team gets left with a patchwork quilt of one-off decisions. Nobody documents the reasoning behind these ad hoc fixes, so untangling why one vendor still has access to Q1 invoices can take more time than just recreating the whole folder. So how do you start to fix it? First step, shine a bright light on every unique permission lurking in the shadows. SharePoint provides some tools here, but you'll probably need to dip into PowerShell or a reporting tool built for this purpose if you want more than a list of high-level sites and libraries. Scripts like gets unique permissions can surface every broken inheritance point, but just remember, these lists can get long fast, especially if nobody ever pruned old project folders. Once you've surfaced the unique permissions, you'll almost always see patterns crop up. Maybe a certain business unit loves direct library access. Maybe the finance department treated every budgeting round as a separate security zone. This is your starting point, not the fix. It's a way to see the boundaries of the problem. Once you can see the landscape, the rule is to remove direct user permissions wherever you possibly can. Each direct permission you replace with a group is like tossing out one mystery key and introducing a master key with a logbook you actually control. Nobody wants to spend afternoons tracking down ex-contractors who still have access to their SharePoint folder because someone missed a single checkbox. By grouping access around business needs, you anchor permissions to the dynamics of teams, not to which person was filling which seat 2 years ago. It's a realistic way to get back in control, and it means that onboarding, offboarding, and role changes stop creating surprise access issues long after the fact. This process is not invisible. People will notice when their access shifts, even if what you're doing is long overdue cleanup. It's important to communicate what's changing and, more importantly, why. There's no need for drama, but transparency will save you flurries of help desk tickets and let users know their files aren't just being shuffled around on a whim. Phrase it around increased protection and easier management, not doom and gloom over past mistakes. Reinventing the permission structure is the goal, not calling out where the old one failed. Nobody wants to do this every year, so set up a schedule for regular permission reviews. It doesn't need to be elaborate, but it does need to be consistent. Quarterly or biannual checks help catch drift before it piles up. Use PowerShell scripts or built-in Microsoft 365 compliance tools for the grunt work. Those will surface changes since the last review, helping catch oddities before they become real problems. Some third-party solutions even automate much of this, offering dashboards that make it easy to spot outliers at a glance. You can work your way back from permission chaos. It's a grind, especially at the start, but the actual payoff isn't just tidier permissions or smoother audits. It's recovering trust, from end users and your own IT teammates who realize new problems aren't going to appear every time someone requests a file. You end up with a model that's transparent, auditable, and able to scale up as your business adds new sites or projects. Underneath it all, the best fix isn't just technical. It's creating a culture where thoughtful permission management is the default, not an afterthought. And when everyone expects reviews and group-centric access, the risks slip way down, and nobody's digging through old emails to answer the next who can see this anymore. Keeping that culture alive is what sets sustainable SharePoint environments apart, because it prevents the same chaos from building up all over again. If it feels like a lot, just remember, each small fix is another step toward getting your environment back under your control. The biggest misconception is that a quick fix for permissions will do the job. Every time you use a shortcut, like breaking inheritance or handing out direct access, you're adding cleanup work for later. If you want SharePoint to work for your organization and not against you, focus on building with groups and keeping regular permission reviews on your calendar. Break inheritance only as an absolute last option. Every access decision you make sends a signal to your users and to your future self about how much you value sustainable security. Keep your model simple, auditable, and aligned with how your teams actually work.